Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are in the exhibitor interviews around the Natural Resources Investment Symposium. I'm delighted today to welcome a colleague of very long standing, Brien Lundin. The relationship between my own organization and Brian's organization goes back many years. His organization, of course, was founded by the late, great James U. Blanchard, a mentor and friend of mine. And Brien today is most well known for two investment products, both of which we intend to talk about today. Gold Newsletter, which, if my memory is intact, is the longest running investor newsletter around the subject of gold on the planet today, or at least the longest running prominent letter, and the New Orleans Investment Conference, which has a long and storied career and frankly, was the author of many of the innovations that I expropriated for our own conference. So, Brien, for many reasons, thank you for your friendship. Thank you for being a business associate and partners of ours for many years. Thank you for sponsoring our conference and for allowing us to sponsor your conference. And generally, welcome.
Thank you, Rick. And from what I gather, my job here is to promote my services. But, what I'm really looking forward to is attending your event and learning alongside everybody else, because if you call it imitating our event, you've done a great job, because what you do is get the top thought leaders out there in macroeconomics and resources in particular, and do a fantastic job of that. So I'm going to be there to learn like everybody else. We need to do that these days because things are moving much more quickly than I think any of us expected in the markets today, and therefore we need this kind of information. So I'm glad that your event, as good as it is coming a few months before my event, so people by attending both can really keep on top of things.
I think that's an important note, Brien. Many people look at us as natural competitors, and I guess we are. But the truth is, over the last 3 decades, we've been more natural collaborators.
Yeah, that's true.
Competitors. One of the things that struck me the other day, I got a wonderful email from a longtime attendee who I won't identify, but you would know this person immediately, should you see him. And he was saying that one of the things that he really enjoys in both our conferences is the ability to watch the speakers and the other exhibitors interact with each other. He was talking specifically about a comment I made about 3 or 4 years ago, following Robert Friedland through my exhibit hall, at a discrete distance, of course, paying attention to which exhibitors he talked at, and which exhibitors made him smile and which exhibitors made him frown. And I remember doing the same thing on the floor of the New Orleans conference. And the thing I wanted to have you elaborate on a little bit is the fact, first of all, that not all the intelligence in the room flows from the dais into the crowd. The crowd possesses substantial intelligence of their own. But the sort of multiple opportunities for education in conferences like yours and mine is important. You've watched this happen for 30 years, so perhaps you could talk about that a bit, the sort of unsung value that attendees get from these conferences.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, I struggle because I write all the marketing copy for my events, and it's something I really struggle to put across. And I just give up and say, listen, you got to go to really experience it and understand what we're talking about here. It is an experience that you have to live through to really understand what the difference is from watching a video from one of your favorite speakers on YouTube and being able to, figuratively grab his elbow. You don't need to hog-tie people to talk to you at the conference. You're standing there next to them, next to the bar, next to the buffet line as they leave a presentation during some specific opportunities in very small gatherings where you can ask your questions, get your personal concerns addressed by these top speakers that you see through all the social media today, through the financial media, et cetera, and really get to know them on a personal basis. But your other point is also important. When you bring people together who, number one, spend money, number two, travel across the continent to spend days at an investment event, they kind of self-identify as at least very active investors, very concerned investors, but they couldn't do all of that if they weren't also successful investors. And I start my event off every year by telling the audience that I'd like to introduce you to the top investment experts you can benefit from at this event over the next few days. Now, look to your left, look to your right, look behind you. They're all around you. These are the people, again, they wouldn't be here if they weren't smart, frankly. You have to be smart to come to these events. You have to be very active and concerned and self-directed. You don't take your guidance from the talking heads in the media. You listen to both sides of the story, you analyze, you gather the data, you come to your own conclusions, and you largely, at least, self-direct your investments. So from that standpoint, there's an ambiance. I like to call it an intellectual energy that just permeates the halls of these events, where there's an excitement. You could just feel it in the air when you not necessarily meet people of like mind, because although we do tend more toward the libertarian conservative end of the spectrum, every one of our attendees is somewhat cynical and experienced and has expertise and experiences that are very valuable, and they're willing to share. And that kind of an environment, that kind of a collaborative environment, is just immensely valuable and, frankly, not just enlightening, but very enjoyable.
That brings up a couple comments of mine, Brian. One is, in terms of the attendees, you get out of it what you put into it. What I learned going to your conference when I first started going in the middle part of the decade of the 80s is I didn't know enough about how to extract value from a conference. And what I learned is I had to plan my day. I had to have my notes ahead of time. What did I want to see? What were my free times going to be? All that kind of stuff. And the second thing I learned, and boy, this was important. At the end of the day, and these are long days. Traditionally, your conference starts at 7 in the morning, thanks to me, and probably ends at 7 o'clock at night. At the end of the day, I have found it's very important to write down what I've learned during the course of the day at night before I go out and sample the joys of New Orleans. In other words, sort of codify the knowledge that I had received during the day so that I'd have the benefit of it 2 or 3 weeks later. Can you amplify either of those points, or are there other things that you've learned in 3 decades of putting on a New Orleans conference that you think would be critical to say to your attendees as to how they could maximize the benefit from the conference?
Yeah, I think that's very important. I need to take notes and make notes just to get through the day these days. So it is understandable, especially in an event like this, where there's the information intelligence is being dealt through a fire hose, and it's hard to, and a lot of times conflicting ideas, because we don't want homogenous views from the conference. We're not there to dictate or proselytize or anything. We're there to present everyone's points of views, and they often conflict, and that's the way you learn. But yeah, our people are information hungry. They're always taking notes, and every year we have attendees who rush to our attendee services booth and say, "I left my notepad in the conference room and can't find it," and they're all distraught, and it's an emergency situation because they've taken so many notes. And even speakers will be in the green room with a lot of these elite experts and highly regarded experts, and they're all taking notes and watching the presentations. It's that kind of an event. It's that kind of people that come. One of the things that you bring up is, there's a lot of delights to sample in New Orleans, and I can share with our audience that Rick Rule has left as many social events and dinners in New Orleans early as he has ever attended, because he is there right at the crack of dawn, virtually in his booth and all day long. And if you want to talk about being accessible, Rick is the most accessible speaker that we've ever had. He is always there to talk with you. And his event and our event are great opportunities to do that.
I think one of the other things, Brian, that is worth mentioning in the context of both events is the importance, if you're attending the event and if there is an exhibitor that you're a shareholder of, an existing shareholder of, get in touch with the exhibitor before you come to New Orleans or before you come to Boca, and say, are there any presentation events that I need to be at? One of the best networking opportunities that I have ever enjoyed in conjunction with both your conference and my conference has been the functions that exhibitors put on at the conferences, the private functions for their own shareholders. And if
Yeah.
you don't ask, you don't get invited. And
Yeah.
I've found that other investors who owned large positions in small companies asked me, or pardon me, asked the management team questions that had never occurred to me to ask. And I got the benefit of, if you will, many inputs in a subject that I already thought I was familiar with. Perhaps you could talk to that as well.
Yeah, and I think it touches on something that I tell people who are these days increasingly new to the sector, and they want to know how to invest in precious metals, how to invest in mining stocks. And one of the points I stress to them is that it's a very inefficient market in mining stocks, in particular junior mining stocks, that if you're willing to spend the time, effort, money, and skull sweat, if you're willing to spend the money to go to the best conferences, subscribe to the half dozen or so best newsletters covering the sector, and really do your homework, you can outwork other investors who aren't willing to do that. And you're able to turn up these gems that are overlooked. They're always out there in this market. There are always a few companies that are waiting to be discovered, and they're tomorrow's biggest winners. You just have to find them. And you and I provide the means for them to do that. But you do have to put in the effort. Yes, talk to the companies beforehand, arrange meetings, see what's going on, talk to them face to face in the exhibit hall. Go look for companies you're not familiar with. Just go to each exhibitor and ask those few questions to get their fundamental stories, get what the unique investing argument is for that company. And one thing that you brought to the table over the years, Rick, and have repeated at our events, and I know yours as well, are some of those key questions that you should be asking these management teams of the companies you're invested in. And of course, it's a great opportunity to look them in the eye, see how they present themselves, see if you believe that they're presenting the story forthrightly and honestly and frankly. But one of the key questions you've always recommended, and I've stolen that from you and shared it with many audiences as well, is once a company has laid out its plan, then tell them or ask them, what do you do when things go wrong? What could go wrong, and what's your plan to address it? What's the most obvious and likely scenario where something is not going to go according to the plan you just laid out? And how are you going to handle that? Because almost invariably it happens. I could point to maybe only one hand the number of junior mining companies in my experience over the better part of 4 decades in the industry, that where everything has gone according to plan and all of the surprises have been good ones. Those are rare and far between, and it's not typically the first project that is the one that really makes it for a junior mining company. So they need to have backup plans. They need to look at all the contingencies, and that's not a question that a lot of management teams are prepared to answer.
Well, I think that's right. And you make a couple of good points there. The first is that you get out of this what you get in. There's a lot of speculators
Right.
who have said to me they got $500,000 in the space or $1 million in the space, but they haven't spent any time educating themselves around the space, which is to say
Mm-hmm.
that the investment technology seems to be got a hunch, bet a bunch. The other is the fact that there is a fair bit of knowledge that you can buy as opposed to having to earn it. That is to say, you can go to conferences, you can subscribe to good newsletters, you can do real work online. And the idea that you can pay somebody to save you from the mistakes that, as an example, contributed to my knowledge
Yeah.
sounds like a really good deal. The second point that I think is important is if there's 2,000 listed companies out there that purport to be junior mining companies, at any one time, there's probably only, I don't know, 250, 300 of them that are worthy of consideration. And part of the thing that you do at a conference, first of all, is see who shows up. See which issuers care enough about you that they're willing to share the story. But the other is to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, the good, the bad, and the ugly. A mistake that you don't make is money good. It's money that you have to invest in another company. What I want to do now in terms of the value proposition, though, is move from your conference and, of course, my conference to Gold Newsletter, which I believe is probably the largest running major newsletter publication in the gold business, having been published continuously for God knows how many decades. Tell me a couple things. Tell me from a broad perspective the value proposition of Gold Newsletter, and tell me too how your experience helping investors over 30 years has shaped the letter. In other words, what are you doing differently to address the needs of the investing audience today? I really want to hear that, the
Yeah.
intellectual progression of the letter over 30 years. Or 40 years.
Well, it has it has taken a big progression. We're actually in our 50th year now. Jim Blanchard started the newsletter in 1971, and I at least
Wow.
like to track the date to the day that Nixon closed the gold window. So last August 15th, the 50th anniversary of that event, is when we kind of celebrated our 50th anniversary, because it was at that point that Jim was determined to advocate for the return of the right of gold ownership to American citizens. So many people don't realize that it was as illegal to own an ounce of gold back in the early 1970s as it was an ounce of plutonium or an ounce of heroin or anything else, which was obviously a ridiculous standpoint from the U.S. government. So Jim knew that that was an abomination. He knew that once the link to gold was severed, then we were going to suffer inflationary spiral, which of course we did. And he was successful in that. And the law was going to be signed to make gold legal again at the end of 1974. So Jim decided to have a conference in the spring of 1974 to educate U.S. investors on how to buy gold and invest in gold, which he did. And of course, that's the conference. We're now in our 48th year. But back then, he could talk about gold philosophically. He could talk about libertarian philosophy. He could talk about sound money and why it was important, but he could not recommend mining stocks. It was actually illegal, again, a ridiculous rule, but it was illegal for newsletters to recommend securities at that point in time, believe it or not, or individual securities, unless the newsletter was pre-approved by the SEC, a process that would take, weeks or months. So there was no way to get timely information out on stocks or individual stocks out to the public until the mid 1980s, rather, when through legislative, or actually through the judicial efforts, we were a number of newsletter publishers were able to get that reversed. And that launched really the stock newsletters, the tout newsletters that proliferated. Gold Newsletter we have tried to set ourselves apart from the crowd by really hanging out or being associated with the best people, the finest people in the industry. People, of course, like you, Rick. Over the years, you were one of my important mentors in the industry and taught me so much about the industry. So we try to adhere to those kinds of standards. I have a very extensive network in the industry. There is literally no one in the industry that refuses to talk to me because they think I'm a jerk. I get along with everybody. I can talk with anybody. I have talked with just about everybody, and no more than 1 degree of separation removed from anybody in the industry. So I get a pretty good feedback on some of the best deals out there. And we do focus on the junior stocks. We don't focus on the big producers. And our goal is to get our readers in early. That's when you can make the most money, if you're in the best deals, the best opportunities with the finest people before the rest of the crowd, before you get that initial run up. And that also, if you get in early, if you get in cheap, that reduces so much risk in an already risky sector. So I would say that's one of the things we focus on. We don't focus so much on thematic investments within the sector. I get asked all the time, do you like gold stocks? Do you like silver stocks? Do you like optionality plays? Do you like exploration plays, energy metals? And I look at each company distinctly on its own merits and for its own story, which there are a lot of stories in the industry, and one of the things we do well, I think, is to find compelling stories and explain why they're compelling. And I think we do as good a job of that as anybody in the industry. And I think I know the track record holds that up as well.
Brien, I would agree with that. The track record, both around Gold Newsletter, which I've been reading for a very long time, and the New Orleans Investment Conference, which I've been attending for a very long time, has been such that it keeps me coming back. I want to thank you on many levels. I want to thank you for the personal friendship that yourself and Fran have offered Bonnie and myself, for the many fine evenings in New Orleans, some of which I remember. For the fine job you've done with Gold Newsletter and the fine job that you've done with the New Orleans Investment Conference. And in particular, I'd like to thank you for your long and steadfast support of our own Natural Resources Investment Symposium. So once again, thank you.
Rick, right back at you. A long and very rewarding and enjoyable experience of both you and Bonnie, and looking forward to many more years to come.